Okay, so the topic today, there's some serious problems with the theory of evolution, including, we're not including the origin of life. A lot of people like to protest that evolution does not talk about the origin of life, so talking about both then. It's semantics. So one problem is, how do you get just those 20 or whatever proteins that, as far as we know, are the ones that account for the functional protein folds that form tissues and organs. As we know, the cell creates proteins through DNA. DNA codes for proteins. RNA is involved in transcription and all that. But Douglas Axe and others have done work on the synthesis of proteins, the chirality of amino acids, and the general problems of creating proteins, and the vast sea of non-folding or non-functional folds proteins. Like, there are very large numbers of proteins possible, and only very few fold into functional organic forms that can make tissues and organs. An analogy that I thought up recently is, I'm into chess, and a lot of my atheist buddies are into chess, and numbers and probabilities and so on. So a lot of you have probably seen that video on Numberphile about how many possible games of chess can be played. And there's different ways of doing that. Like, you take the average number of moves per game by the average number of moves possible per turn, or per 2 turns. And the guy who did this early on, I think it's called Shannon, of Shannon Information fame, he came up with a number like 10 to the 40 or 10 to the 120, I think it was. 10 to the 120, yeah. So that's the number of possible games, but that doesn't account for rational games that someone would actually play. The absolute number for how many possible games there are goes far beyond what Shannon estimated on the back of a napkin. It's something like 10 to the 10 to the 50 or something astronomical. And both of those numbers, by the way, outsize the number of atoms in the universe. Now, there's been more exacting sort of estimates on how many possible games are there that... The hell is that? This dickhead left his phone in my car. I can never get an uninterrupted video here. Audio. Gonna have to just let it ring out. I can't find it. Oh, big goof. Pause. Now, one objection a person can make, I made it myself while thinking about it. One objection you can make to the idea that the types of proteins that are useful in life are only 20 or so out of the vast sea of possible proteins, how they fold. Only a few are useful for the life that we know about. The objection might be, well, let's say the entire reptile lineage died out 10,000 years ago, right? Let's just say that happened. Maybe it was restricted to some island that went under the sea, and we've never seen a fossil, and we have no evidence that but they did exist. Now, a biologist might come along and say, or a molecular biologist or a chemist might come along and say, well, they'd have no knowledge of the sorts of protein folds or organs or organizational plans that might go into making reptiles. That doesn't mean reptiles can't be made, because obviously in this scenario they already existed, right? So are there whole other constellations of organisms, whole other possible ecosystems that may have emerged from different protein building? And is there a way to discover what kinds might exist? You certainly can't find them blindly through a blind search. You can't just sit in a lab and make different proteins and hope they turn into some tissue. You wouldn't even know what the tissue was without reference to the organism it would be useful for. So maybe someone can come up with a non-blind, non-stochastic search methodology of finding out if other proteins might have useful folds for other. Maybe a supercomputer could do something like this, just rapidly discover all the trillions of possible proteins and see how they might fit together to make an animal. But I would say we're probably 100 years out from where we'd have a computer that could do that, if ever. But that would be... It's an interesting objection. It would be an interesting project to do after we're all long dead. All right, then. All right, back to what I was saying here.
later.
So, some estimates have been made on the number of rational games that can be played, and it's less than the number of atoms in the universe, surely, but it's still gargantuan. It's like 10 to the 20. Numberphile said that this number of rational games that can be played, if you know the rules, you're only likely to make 2 or 3 moves on any given turn. Limiting games by the rule of only so many moves after all the pawns are gone, and repetition and so on. So applying all that, you get the number like 10 to the 20th power. And that would take, if every human on the planet was playing chess games every day, it would take trillions of years. What do we have in the universe here? Supposedly 13.8. But the number of rational rule-bound games, like the number of games that anyone's likely to play based on the rationality of chess itself, the rules of chess, which is something only intelligence applies, really. If you have a random chess generator that just plays any move blindly, that's very different from a chess game that is played by the rules of the rational moves. So what is the space out of possible games, that 10 to the 10 to the 50 number, or 10 to the 10 to the 50, what proportion of that number is the number 10 to the 20? Or I think it was 10 to the 10 to the 50 over 10 to the 20. So if you're just letting a random chess game engine play random games without any recognition of the rational moves, how long will that blind process take to come up with a single useful move? And that's sort of analogous to how you build a protein, because each step in building a protein is like each move. So then what are the odds you're going to get multiple successive rational moves to build one of these 20 proteins out of the vast sea of possible proteins? Because each move is a blind step. So I thought I'd use a chess analogy here to help my atheist friends understand Doug Axe's work. I hope the analogy works. The other problems are chicken and egg problem. Like, DNA is just useless information, like that nucleotide bases and acids. That information is useless without the overriding architecture of the cell and the other, the RNA and the ribosomes and all that actually copies and creates the proteins. This also that's a totally separate problem. The actual information in the DNA, how is that even originated out of all the possible sort of arbitrary sequences of possible acids and bases? And you have the problem of molecular machinery. If any of these molecular machines don't have a plausible evolutionary history through like co-option or acceptation, you have a huge problem there. Also, the morphology, body plans of animals are not strictly controlled by the DNA, they're controlled by other parts of the cell. You have a massive problem with the origin of new form in biology and the origin of the first functional cell or the first life, however you want to define life. And there's also the huge amount of fine-tuning that goes into the planet itself. Things that are fine-tuned at the most basic physical and chemistry levels that only allow the expression of certain forms that allow life to live on Earth. Like, it's not just that the life is suited to the environment is also suited to life. Now, you might object and say, well, if the environment was different, then the life would have adapted differently, but it doesn't work that way, because any kind of life is going to need certain things in the environment, going everything from the basic laws of physics and constants and so on, all the way down to specific things that happen on our planet that are restricted by the rules of physics and chemistry, and also by a lot of lucky accidents on how Earth is. What else do we have? Well, there's more. Damn, just a lighter dead. Fossil gaps. By now it seems pretty clear that the fossil record is very reflective of what actually existed on Earth, because we have tons of soft tissue fossils that are well fossilized. So why don't we have more than a few plausible, like the bird dinosaur thing or the whale evolution? Now those have been debunked or attempted to be debunked, and the debunking is pretty strong. But even if we allow for those, you just don't have a fossil record that reflects any sort of gradual evolutionary process. It doesn't fade into itself. It's not gradual. It's starkly discontinuous, and it's more discontinuous the higher up the chain of order that you go. Like the big classes in phyla have no intermediates between them. Like if they all started from a common ancestor, then you'd expect a long stepwise process to produce these different classes. But you don't see that. You don't see anything like that. The higher up the hierarchy of order, the larger categories that include the subcategories. In other words, like there's much better chains between species than there are between genuses. There's much better chains between genuses. There might not be any, but somebody can maybe contrive one. There are more of those than you'll see between kingdoms and phyla. So you'd expect just the opposite, right? Because there's way more intermediate steps to diverge a plant from an animal than a dog from a bear. So the fossil record is reliable. It's absolutely discontinuous. So it's looking like there's these leaps, these evolutionary leaps. We also have the problem of population genetics. There's not enough time in most animal populations, given the rate of mutation. If you have a uniformitarian intuition that the rate of mutation is the same or similar for animals and reptiles, the evolutionary sequences that we've seen, they happen to abruptly to allow for the many coordinated mutations that would be necessary to produce major transitions of form, like even the whale one. We know the population sizes roughly. We know the population genetics. We know the rate of mutations. And, it doesn't work. Doesn't seem to work. Now, this doesn't mean God. It means intelligence or foresight or teleology. It doesn't necessarily mean God. It might, like if with other premises added, it might. Or if you could rule out any sort of non-intelligent process. Well, let me rephrase that. If you could rule out any sort of process that's inherent in life, that has some sort of foresight, intelligence, or feedback from the environment, you might call it a distributed intelligence or some intelligence we don't understand. Maybe the cell knows what it's doing. It's not fully mechanistic or accidental. If the cell is smart, or if matter itself is smart, then you may have some wild new theory of naturalistic evolution. But you need a different conception of nature for this to work. But where matter has some potentiality to be intelligent, at least at some stage, there has to be some intelligence. There has to be some foresight, some feedback, knowledge from the environment. You can't get it through these stochastic search processes, not at the protein level, not at the DNA level, not at the cell level, not at the level of the evolution of molecular machines in the cell, not at the level of the great leaps of evolution between forms, between big kingdoms and phyla and so on. So the picture is very bleak, and that's why most evolutionary biologists are looking for mechanisms other than mutation. We already have lots of these, but are those sufficient? And I think Stephen Meyer does a pretty good job breaking down both the proposed mechanisms for evolution itself and the proposed theories of origin of life. They're full of problems, and that doesn't mean in 100 years we won't have a better theory. I know we'll have a different one, but will it be adequate without the introduction of intelligence or information that could be understood in some way, even if only by a cell? That's all for now, but just thought I'd give a rundown on some of the big problems in evolution. There's probably a dozen or 20 others that I can't even think of off the top of my head or don't even know about yet. All right then, go away.